Dottie Macalister, at 72 years old, had always believed that 46 years of marriage meant something, that loving a man through his work, his silence, his illness, and his death earned you a place in his story. But when the lawyer read Gordon's will in a room full of nephews who smelled blood, the silence that followed told her everything. Dottie wasn't just overlooked, she was erased, as if 46 years of devotion could be reduced to 3 acres of swamp and a pile of rust. While Gordon's nephews divided 600 acres of prime forest, the family house, and all the mineral rights between themselves, already calculating what they'd sell and what they'd clear-cut, Dottie received what the lawyer called a token gesture to the surviving spouse, a rusted 1940s sawmill on boggy, worthless land. When Russ Macalister handed her the deed, he laughed in her face and said, "Here's your share, Aunt Dottie. Try not to cut yourself on the rust." But what those arrogant nephews didn't know, what they were too greedy and too careless to understand, was that the rusted sawmill they had just laughed at contained a secret worth more than everything they had just inherited. Gordon Macalister had spent the last 25 years of his life preparing for this exact moment. He had seen the betrayal coming. He had planned for it with the patience of a man who thinks in decades. And he had sealed the answer inside the great oak log carriage of that sawmill with marine epoxy, waiting for the day when his wife would most need to know that he had always loved her and that she was never, ever powerless. If you've ever felt the world underestimated you because of your age, if you've been discarded by the very people who should have valued you, if you've thought everything was lost when it was actually just beginning, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Dottie found when she pried open that oak beam will make you believe that love never gets the address wrong. Welcome to the last chapter. Dottie was 72 years old, a retired school librarian who had spent 46 years married to Gordon Macalister, a quiet, steady man who worked in timber and forestry the way other men worked in steel or stone. Gordon hadn't been a rich man, but he had been a careful one, a steward of the family's holdings, with a reverence for the old-growth forest that bordered on spiritual. He spent every Saturday at the sawmill, the old 1940s structure that his grandfather had built, that his father had run, that he had maintained with meticulous care even after it had stopped being commercially viable. In the last years of his life, as cancer slowly ate away at him, he still found ways to get out there, still ran his hands across the great oak and iron log carriage that had been the heart of the mill's operation for 80 years. Gordon died 14 months ago on an ordinary Tuesday in March. Dottie had been holding his hand. They had been married since she was 25 years old, and for 46 years she had listened to him talk about the forest, the ring count in the pines, the way paper birch grew stronger when you thinned the surrounding trees, the math of sustainable harvest, the philosophy of leaving something better than you found it. She had listened in the way that wives listen to their husbands, not always understanding the technical details, but understanding completely the love that was underneath every word he spoke. The lawyer's letter informed her that Gordon's will, written 20 years earlier and never updated, contained language that had created an impossible situation. The will said that the Macalister family timber holdings, 600 acres of prime forest, the family house in Marquette, and all timber rights thereto, were to pass to the Macalister family. Gordon's brother had died 15 years earlier, but his brother's sons, Russ and Wayne, had descended on the lawyer's office within weeks of Gordon's death, with arguments about what family meant and who deserved what. Russ Macalister was 50 years old and had the thick neck and ruddy face of a man who'd spent his life in the sun doing manual labor, but with the swagger of someone who'd never had to worry about money. He wore an unzipped black Carhartt jacket, even when it was warm outside, and he always had a toothpick in his mouth that he would shift from one side to the other when he was thinking, or more often, when he was laughing at his own jokes. His brother Wayne was 47 and followed Russ's lead in everything, a quieter version of the same greed and dismissal. Neither of them had spent much time with Gordon in recent years, and neither of them had ever expressed the slightest interest in forestry or conservation or any of the philosophical questions that had animated their uncle's entire life. The settlement came down to this. Russ and Wayne got the 600 acres of prime timber holdings and the family house. They got the deeds and the mineral rights and the commercial harvesting rights. They got, in other words, everything that Gordon had spent 40 years carefully managing and protecting. And Dottie got the Sawmill, the old 1940s structure on 3 acres of scrubby jack pine land that was rocky and boggy and commercially worthless, the kind of land that developers wouldn't touch and loggers wouldn't bother with. The sawmill itself was rusted and deteriorating and hadn't been run commercially in 30 years. The lawyer had called it a token gesture to the surviving spouse. Dottie had called it what it was, a joke. And when Russ showed up at the property to officially hand over the deed, he had made absolutely sure she understood that he knew it was a joke. He stood in front of the weathered timber frame structure with its rusted corrugated metal roof, the massive log carriage sitting on iron rails like some great beast that had died mid-motion, and he laughed. His brother laughed. They handed her the deed, and Russ said, "Here's your share, Aunt Dottie. Try not to cut yourself on the rust." Wayne snickered, and they left. What Russ didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that the rusted sawmill he had just laughed at contained something worth more than everything he had just inherited. And Gordon had made sure that only one person in the world would ever find it. 46 years. Gone in one afternoon, reduced to a joke and a handshake in a rusted building nobody wanted. Dottie had taken the deed and walked away with dignity intact, but with her heart breaking in ways that didn't show on her face. She had come to this marriage as a school librarian, a woman who had spent her life surrounded by books and children, teaching people to read and to love stories. She had married a man who was quiet and kind and completely devoted to his work. She had spent 46 years being married to him, learning his world, understanding his values, and now she was being told that her place in his world was worth a handful of rusted metal and scrubby land. The months after Gordon's death had been suffused with a particular kind of grief that Dottie had to navigate carefully. She retired from the school library after 42 years, having delayed retirement by 2 years to care for Gordon as he declined. Her pension was modest. The rented house in Newberry was small and cold in winter. She had no children, something she and Gordon had accepted together as one of life's mysterious disappointments, and so there was no one to fuss over her, or make sure she was eating properly, or help her figure out what to do with her days. Now that she had been given back the gift of time, but not the companion she wanted to spend it with. She spent much of those first months after his death in a fog of administrative tasks, closing his accounts, sorting through papers, deciding what of his things she could stand to look at and what needed to go to Goodwill or the trash. His flannel shirts hung in the closet of the rented house for 6 months before she finally boxed them up. And when she did, she cried for an hour with her face buried in a shirt that still smelled faintly of his cologne and the pine sap that had permanently embedded itself in his skin over decades of work. What hurt most was the knowledge that Russ and Wayne had already begun cutting the forest that Gordon had spent his entire adult life protecting. Dottie learned through the grapevine that they'd hired a commercial logging crew within 2 months of settling the will, and the crew had started immediately, bringing heavy equipment in on the logging road, felling trees in the clear-cut pattern that maximized short-term profit while destroying the ecosystem that Gordon had worked to preserve. Dottie drove out there once and saw it with her own eyes. The stumps, the crushed undergrowth, the erosion already beginning, the devastation that 1 year of efficient commercial harvesting could accomplish. She couldn't save that forest. It wasn't hers to save. Or so she believed. That belief was wrong. Spectacularly, beautifully wrong. But the knowledge that her husband's life work was being methodically destroyed by men who didn't understand its value and didn't care about anything beyond the profit margin created a secondary grief that was different from missing him, but just as heavy. It was the grief of watching his legacy die. It was the grief of understanding that the values he had devoted his life to, stewardship, patience, the idea of building something that would last beyond your own lifetime, had counted for nothing in the eyes of his own family. Dottie would lie awake at night listening to the rain on the roof of the rented house and think about the forest being stripped bare tree by tree. The complex ecosystem that Gordon had spent his life protecting being reduced to stumps and erosion and ecological devastation. She thought about calling Russ, about begging him to slow down, to reconsider, to think about what Gordon would have wanted. But she didn't know yet that she wouldn't need to beg anyone. She didn't know that her husband had already given her the power to stop every chainsaw on that land with a single phone call. That discovery was still weeks away, hidden inside a wooden bookmark she hadn't yet unpacked, but she knew what the response would be. She knew that Russ would laugh and tell her that Gordon was dead, and sentiment didn't pay the bills. She knew that her words would have no power against the kind of greed that had motivated him to fight so hard for the family's inheritance in the first place. The summer after Gordon's death was particularly difficult because it was the season when he would have been at his busiest in the forest, walking the timber, assessing growth patterns, planning for the next generation of harvests. Dottie had spent every summer of her marriage following him out to the forest at least once a week, sitting in the shade of old pines while he worked, reading her books, listening to him explain what he was doing and why it mattered. The summers after his death were quiet and empty. She found herself driving past the logging operation without meaning to, as if some part of her hoped to see that it had stopped, that someone had realized what a terrible mistake was being made, that the forest might still be saved. But each time she drove past, the devastation had grown. More trees were gone, more erosion was visible, more of Gordon's life work had been undone, and Dottie could do nothing but watch, or so she thought. And then everything changed, not with a phone call or a court order or a dramatic confrontation, but with a 5-inch piece of carved wood that had been sitting in a box of books for years, waiting for exactly this moment. So when Dottie found the wooden bookmark in early May, unpacking a box of Gordon's books that she'd finally brought to the rented house, her world tilted in a way she wasn't expecting. The bookmark was small, about 5 inches long, carved in the rough shape of a pine tree, the kind of thing a man might carve on a long winter evening when his hands needed to be busy and his mind needed to work through a problem. The wood was old, stained with age and use. She held it up to the afternoon light coming through the rented house kitchen window and saw the fine grain of the wood, the careful symmetry of the carving. This was not a casual project. This was a thing that had been made with intention and care, a thing that Gordon had thought about while making it. On the back, in Gordon's careful, deliberate handwriting, were 7 words. "The carriage holds the truth, Dot. Where the oak meets the iron. Pry where the knot is." Dottie's first thought was that she didn't understand. Her second thought was that Gordon had written this, knowing that she wouldn't understand at first, that it would take her time to decipher what he meant, that the mystery itself was part of the message. She thought about Gordon's mind, which worked slowly and carefully through problems, which never rushed to conclusions, which was always thinking 5 steps ahead. She thought about the quality of patience that he had, the way he could wait for the right moment to do things, the way he had never been a man in a hurry. And then she realized that he had carved this bookmark years ago, had hidden it in a box of books, and had died knowing that someday his wife would unpack those books and find it. He had waited his whole life for this moment, had planned for it, had left this clue, knowing that she would find it eventually. She set the bookmark down on the kitchen table very carefully, as if it might break or disappear if she wasn't gentle with it. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the ordinary street in the ordinary town, and she felt something shift inside of her. Somewhere in this world, she didn't know where yet, but she was certain now that it existed somewhere. Gordon had left something for her, something important enough that he had spent time and energy hiding it, something that he had wanted her to find, something that he believed would matter to her after he was gone. In a strange way, she felt less alone than she had felt since his death. She felt like she had a task, a purpose, a mystery that only she could solve, because only she would know where to look. Dottie read those words 5 times before she understood them. She sat on the edge of her bed with Gordon's books spread around her, and her heart beginning to beat in a different rhythm. The log carriage, the massive oak and iron sled that moved logs through the saw blade. She had watched him work on it, watched him tend to it with the kind of care most people reserved for fine art. She remembered the year he'd had it completely resealed, the year he'd refinished some of the oak by hand, the endless hours he'd spent there in the sawmill that everyone else assumed he was wasting away in there, grieving after it stopped being commercially viable. She hadn't understood then. She understood now that he had been doing something else entirely. Every Saturday afternoon in that sawmill, every hour spent running his hands over that oak beam, he hadn't been grieving the end of the mill's usefulness. He had been building a vault, and what he had sealed inside it was about to turn Russ and Wayne's celebration into a nightmare. By the time Dottie had packed her brown leather suitcase with a change of clothes, a thermos of coffee, and her late husband's old work gloves, the sun was setting. She would wait for morning. She'd learned at 72 that pre-dawn drives down logging roads when you're emotionally overwrought is the kind of decision that gets people hurt. But she didn't sleep. She sat in her rented house with Gordon's wooden bookmark in her hands, turning it over and over, and she thought about the 3 acres of scrubby land and the rusted sawmill that everyone else had dismissed as worthless. She thought about the man she had married, who had been so patient, so careful, so deliberate in all his actions. She thought about the way he would plan for years in advance, the way he thought in terms of cycles that spanned decades. She thought about a man who would take the time to carve a bookmark and hide it in a box of books and wait, perhaps for years, for his wife to find it. What had he been planning? What had he understood that he'd never told her? Morning came gray and cool, the way it does in early May in the Upper Peninsula, with mist rising from the forest floor and paper birch trees glowing white in the uncertain light. Dottie dressed in layers, a white turtleneck under her heather gray wool pullover, dark brown canvas work pants, her tan leather lace-up boots, and she braided her long white hair into a soft bun at the nape of her neck. She put on the delicate gold-rimmed oval glasses she wore for reading and for looking at details, the kind of glasses that made her look like the librarian she had been rather than the widow she had become. The drive to the sawmill took 40 minutes. The logging road was narrow and rutted, winding through dense jack pine and paper birch, the forest floor carpeted in decades of needles and moss. A woodpecker hammered somewhere in the trees. The smell of wet earth and pine resin came through the open car window. Dottie's hands were steady on the wheel, but her heart was racing the way it had only raced when she was very young, during moments of significant change, moments when she could feel her life pivoting on the edge of one choice or another. The sawmill emerged from the forest the way ruins always do, first as an impression, a disturbance in the pattern of trees, and then as a fully formed structure that had somehow been here all along, waiting for her to be ready to see it. The building was perhaps 80 feet long, open-sided, with a timber frame structure and a corrugated metal roof that had rusted to shades of brown and orange. The main saw blade sat in the middle of the structure, frozen in place, rusted into immobility. And dominating the length of the floor was the log carriage, the great oak and iron sled that had been the mechanical heart of the whole operation, moving logs forward and back through the blade, precise and powerful. It was beautiful in the way that dying things can sometimes be beautiful, with the beauty of something that has served its purpose and endured beyond its usefulness. The ferns were growing through the plank floor. Moss covered part of the timber frame. Rusted chains and pulleys hung from the crossbeams, and there was a collapsed lumber drying shed attached to one end. The whole property was peaceful in a way that abandoned places often are, as if the land itself was resting after the noise and violence of commercial operation. Slowly healing, Dottie parked her car and sat for a moment, looking at the building. Then she got out, leaving the brown leather suitcase on the passenger seat for now, and walked toward the entrance. Her boots crunched on the gravel and on scattered nails and bits of rusted metal. The morning light was soft and gray, filtering through the clouds and through the gaps in the metal roof, and as her eyes adjusted to the interior dimness, the log carriage came into full focus. She walked the length of it slowly, running her hands along the great oak beam that formed the main body of the sled. The wood was smooth in some places, rough in others, deeply grained with the patterns of age and exposure. She could see where Gordon had worked on it, areas where the finish was newer, where the oak had been carefully resealed. She could see the marks of his hands, metaphorically, if not literally, the evidence of decades of attention. Then she found the knot. It was on the underside of the main beam, not a place she would have naturally looked if Gordon hadn't told her to. One of those irregular grain patterns that all wood has, unremarkable in itself. But around it, sealed with what looked like marine epoxy, was a distinct ring of sealant, something that clearly did not belong there, something that was deliberate and careful and designed to exclude moisture and access. Dottie's hands began to shake. She was standing inches away from whatever her husband had spent 25 years hiding, and she was about to discover that the man she thought she knew completely had been carrying a secret that would rewrite everything she believed about her marriage, her inheritance, and her place in the world. She went back to her car and retrieved the suitcase, and from it she took Gordon's old work gloves, rough, stained with years of work, still carrying the faint ghost of his smell. She also found a chisel and hammer in a rusted toolbox that was still in the sawmill, left here years ago and never retrieved. She wrapped the chisel head in an old cloth to muffle the sound and began to work. The epoxy had been applied skillfully, but it was old now, exposed to decades of the Michigan temperature swings that crack and stress everything. It came away gradually, Dottie working patiently, carefully, like she was doing surgery, like she was defusing a bomb. She had never been a particularly mechanical person, had never fixed anything more complex than a leaky kitchen sink, but her hands remembered the work from watching Gordon, from those Saturday afternoons when she would sit in the sawmill while he worked, reading library books in the weak light and watching his methodical progress. It took 3 hours. By the time the marine epoxy had cracked and broken away enough to reveal what lay beneath, her arms were tired and her heart was pounding so hard that she had to sit down on the edge of the log carriage and breathe carefully for several minutes. The knot, which was actually a deliberately carved wooden seal, came away in her hands, revealing a hollow cavity that had been somehow chiseled out from the oak beam itself, a feat of carpentry that must have taken Gordon days, possibly weeks of painstaking work done in secret, done in this quiet mill, done with the knowledge that his wife would find it eventually. And there it was, inside the cavity, wrapped carefully in waterproof canvas that had kept everything pristine despite the decades, were 3 things. First, a set of documents bound together with a rubber band that had become brittle with age. Second, a single piece of paper that appeared to be an official Forest Service survey. Third, a handwritten letter in a cream-colored envelope with Dottie's name written in Gordon's careful script. Dottie lifted them out with hands that were not steady. She didn't open them there in the semi-darkness of the sawmill with the dust motes floating in the gray light. Instead, she wrapped them carefully back in the canvas, put them in her brown leather suitcase, and drove back to the rented house in Newberry. She drove carefully, obeying all the speed limits, feeling as though she was carrying something that could break at any moment. Something that was fragile despite being made of paper and ink and legal documents. Back at the house, sitting at her kitchen table with strong coffee and the afternoon light coming through the windows, she finally opened them. The first documents were timber rights certificates dating back to 1962, filed in the name of Gordon's grandfather and transferred to Gordon in 1989. They covered 400 acres of the property that Russ and Wayne were clear-cutting. 400 acres of what the documents identified as old-growth forest with timber that had never been harvested. But the second document was the one that changed everything. The Forest Service survey, dated 2018, valued the standing timber at $4.2 million. $4.2 million. Dottie set the paper down. She picked up her coffee. She set the coffee down. She read the number again. That was not the kind of number that meant anything to someone like Dottie, who had lived her entire life on modest means, but it was clearly the kind of number that should have meant something to Russ and Wayne, and apparently they didn't know it existed. The letter was dated just 3 months before Gordon died. Dottie opened it with the envelope addressed in her husband's hand, and she began to read his words to her, written in the knowledge that he was dying. Written to explain something he had apparently never explained before. "My dearest Dot," the letter began, and Dottie had to stop reading for a moment because her eyes were blurring with tears. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have been left to figure out what these papers mean and why I have left them for you in this way. I know you think I have wasted my time out here at the mill in these later years, that I was just fooling around with old equipment and old wood. I understand why you thought that. But I was doing something else, my love. I was making sure that when I died, you would not be powerless. I was making sure that the forest Gordon built his life around would not be destroyed by men who see only profit and not stewardship. 25 years ago, I realized that my brother and his sons were not going to care for this land the way we have. I realized that when I died, there would be a fight over the property, and I realized that the likelihood was that you, my wife of 46 years, would be left with nothing, while men with greed in their hearts would clear-cut the forest that has been in this family for 3 generations. So I did something that you did not know about. I had a timber rights attorney separate the timber rights from the land ownership. I filed new documents in 1989, transferring the timber rights specifically and only to myself as an individual, not as part of the family holdings. I put those documents where I could put them and trusted that you would find them after I was gone. The 3 acres and the sawmill are yours now, Dot. But so is the access to 400 acres of old-growth forest. So is the legal authority to prevent any harvest of that timber without your permission. They see scrap metal, Dottie. You see what I built. That's why it's yours. That's why the forest is yours. That's why you are not powerless. I want you to do something with this responsibility. I don't want you to sell the timber to the highest bidder, though you could, and it would make you wealthy. I want you to put that forest under conservation easement. I want you to implement the sustainable harvest plan that I have been developing for 30 years, the one that allows for careful harvesting that will maintain the health of the forest and provide income for a long life ahead of you, but that will never clear cut, will never destroy. Will you do this for me? Will you be the steward that I couldn't be long enough? I love you more than I have ever said, and I have loved you in silence, and in the forest, and in this mill that we have spent so many Saturday afternoons in together. Thank you for listening to me talk about timber and ecology and philosophy all these years, even when you did not always understand. You understood something more important. You understood that I cared, and caring is the foundation of love. Yours forever, Gordon. Dottie read the letter 3 times, once for understanding, once for the emotion of it, and once for the simple fact of hearing her husband's voice in her head, the way he would have said the words, the careful deliberation with which he would have chosen each phrase. She wept while reading, the kind of crying that starts from deep in the chest and involves the whole body, the kind of crying that is grief and rage and vindication and love all at once. She kept reading the words, They see scrap metal, Dottie. You see what I built. That's why it's yours. Over and over again. And each time she read them, she understood something new about her husband, about how he had seen her, about what he believed she was capable of. He had believed that she could do what needed to be done. He had believed that she would understand, eventually, that her power was not in being liked or accepted by Russ and Wayne, but in being the keeper of something they could not touch. He had believed in her in a way that she had never quite believed in herself. The legal implications of what Gordon had done began to unfold as Dottie talked to more lawyers, more experts, more people who understood the intricacies of timber rights and forest management. The separation of timber rights from land was a real legal mechanism, though it was not commonly used. The filing from 1962 was ironclad. It had been done properly, filed correctly, and had been valid for 60 years. The transfer to Gordon in 1989 was equally legal and binding. The 400 acres of standing timber that Russ and Wayne thought they owned could not be harvested without Dottie's permission, no matter what the deed to the land said. They owned the dirt, but not the trees, not a single one. It was an unusual situation, but it was absolutely legal, and it meant that Russ and Wayne's entire clear-cutting operation was a violation of law. Then she called a lawyer, a timber rights lawyer, not the corporate attorney who had represented the Macalister family, but someone completely independent, someone whose job was to understand documents like these and confirm their validity. The lawyer examined everything: the original filing from 1962, the transfer document from 1989, the Forest Service survey, Gordon's detailed notes about the conservation easement he had designed but never formally filed, and confirmed that every single thing was valid. The timber rights were real. The valuation was accurate. The easement plan was legally sound. And Dottie Macalister, 72-year-old former school librarian, now had legal control over 400 acres of forest worth millions, and the responsibility to protect it for the rest of her life and possibly beyond. Now, remember, Russ and Wayne had been clear-cutting that forest for months, believing they had every right to do so. They had no idea that a 72-year-old retired librarian was about to shut down their entire operation with a single legal filing. What happened next is the part of this story that Russ Macalister will never recover from. The lawyer sent a cease and desist letter to Russ and Wayne, informing them that they were in violation of Dottie's timber rights and that any further logging on the 400 acres would result in legal action and injunctions. Russ called the house, his voice loud and angry on the phone, claiming that the documents were forgeries, that Gordon had no right to separate timber rights from land, that he would tie Dottie up in litigation for the rest of her natural life. Dottie listened quietly, and then she hung up without saying a single word. She didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. Within a week, a court injunction had been issued. Within 2 weeks, the clear-cutting operation had stopped, with heavy equipment pulled off the land and the logging crew paid off and sent elsewhere. Within a month, Russ had hired his own lawyer, who reviewed the documents and informed him that there was no legal standing for a challenge. The timber rights were valid, they had been validly transferred, and Dottie had every right to control them. The injunction stood. The chainsaws went silent, and for the first time in over a year, the forest was quiet again. Russ came to see her once, showing up at her rented house on a Saturday morning in early June, his face red with anger, demanding to negotiate. He wanted to buy the timber rights. He wanted to negotiate a price. He wanted her to understand that this whole thing was a family matter and should be handled as such. Dottie invited him in, sat him down at her kitchen table, gave him coffee that he didn't ask for, and explained to him quietly and clearly what her husband had written, what his grandfather had filed 64 years earlier, and what Dottie's plans were for the forest. When she began to explain what Gordon had done and why, Russ stood up from the kitchen table so suddenly that he knocked over the coffee cup. The liquid spread across the white tablecloth like a brown stain of accusation. "You're lying," he said, his face darkening with rage. "Gordon would never do something like that. He was my uncle. He would never betray the family like this." But even as he said it, Dottie could see the moment when he realized it was true. She could see the moment when his brain calculated what this meant for his clear-cutting operation, what it meant for his plans to sell the timber and make a quick profit. His anger transformed into something more desperate. "Okay," he said. "Okay, so maybe the documents are real. So what? Let's talk about this like adults. What would it take for you to sell those rights to me? What's your price?" Dottie's answer was simple and unchanging. "They're not for sale. Not at any price." Russ's voice began to rise then, his toothpick moving faster from one side of his mouth to the other as he paced the small living room. He told her she was being unreasonable. He told her that she was an old woman who didn't understand business. He told her that Gordon must have been senile or drugged when he made those plans. That no sane man would cut his own nephew out of an inheritance this valuable. His words came faster and faster, his anger filling the small rented house like a physical presence, bouncing off the walls, making the windows rattle. She told Russ that the forest would be placed under permanent conservation easement. She told him that the timber rights would be managed according to a sustainable harvest plan that Gordon had developed, a plan that would provide modest income without destroying the ecosystem. She told him that the old-growth forest would be protected, probably forever. She told him that every tree that fell in that forest would be fallen only with her permission, and she would give permission only when it served the conservation of the ecosystem. She spoke calmly, her voice never raising, using the same patient tones she had used for decades when speaking to children in the school library. She spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who had examined all the options and chosen the path that she could live with for the rest of her life. She told him that he could sue if he wished, but that he would lose. She told him that she was 72 years old and she had nothing to lose and everything to protect, and that his greed would not move her. She told him that his Uncle Gordon had loved this forest more than he had loved money, and that Dottie intended to honor that love for the rest of her life. She told him that in loving Gordon, she had come to understand what he had been trying to protect, and that nothing Russ could say or do would change her mind. She told him that his uncle had put his faith in her, and she was not going to let him down. She told him that the documents were legal, the timber rights were real, and the forest was going to be protected, whether he liked it or not. Russ left after 20 minutes. He slammed the door hard enough that the pictures on the wall rattled, and Dottie heard his car engine start with a furious roar. She stood at the window and watched him drive away, his truck disappearing around the corner with more speed than the quiet residential street called for. Wayne sent a letter through his lawyer asking if there was any flexibility in Dottie's position, asking if she would be willing to negotiate, asking if perhaps they could come to some kind of compromise. Dottie wrote back a single sentence: no. The legal documents were filed. The conservation easement was registered. The sustainable harvest plan was implemented. The forest was safe. For the first time since Gordon had died, Dottie felt like she had done something that mattered, something that would endure, something that would honor her husband's memory, not just in her heart, but in the world. But this story doesn't end with a legal victory. What Dottie did next, what she chose to build from the ashes of her grief, is the part that proves Gordon chose the right person to carry his legacy forward. For herself, Dottie did something that surprised everyone, most of all herself. Instead of selling a modest amount of timber from the conservation easement to generate income, she took the income from a small pension adjustment and used it to begin restoring the old sawmill. She hired a contractor, a young man named Marcus, who was fascinated by historic preservation and who understood what the building could become, and together they developed a plan to restore it as an educational site, a place where local high school students could come to learn about sustainable forestry and the history of the forest industry in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. She donated the sawmill to a local land trust to be operated as a learning center. She established a scholarship fund in Gordon's name for students interested in forestry and conservation. She began walking the forest trails every morning, carrying her brown leather suitcase with her on many of those walks, though mostly she just liked having it there, liked the feeling of having something substantial in her hands. 1 year after finding the documents, Dottie stood outside the restored sawmill on a golden hour evening, with paper birch trees glowing white and gold around her, and she cried again, but this time it was not the cry of grief or rage or vindication. It was the cry of someone who had found a way to honor the life of someone she loved, a way to make sure that the values that had animated his existence were not lost to the world, a way to turn what had seemed like devastation into something that resembled purpose. The wooden bookmark still sits on her windowsill, next to a jar of pine needles and a photograph of Gordon standing in front of the sawmill with his hand on the great oak carriage, smiling at the camera in the particular quiet way that he had of smiling. Sometimes Dottie picks up the bookmark and reads the words on the back. "The carriage holds the truth, Dot. Where the oak meets the iron, pry where the knot is." And she remembers that all along, he was planning for her future, planning for a future she couldn't yet imagine, planning for a way that she could stand on her own and protect what he loved. These days, Dottie walks through the forest in the early mornings, when the mist is still rising from the forest floor and the light is just beginning to filter through the canopy of old-growth pines. The cathedral silence of the ancient forest surrounds her. The paper birch glows white. The jack pine stands tall and patient. The tamarack grows along the edges of the boggy places. And sometimes, in that profound quiet, Dottie swears she can hear footsteps just ahead of hers on the trail, steady and purposeful, moving deeper into the forest. She smiles and keeps walking, because she knows who it is, and she knows where they're going. Gordon's forest is safe now. It will be safe for another generation, and another after that, because a man loved it enough to make careful, secret plans, and because a woman loved him enough to find those plans and honor them. The timber industry moved on. Clear-cut operations stripped other forests. Profit margins were realized in other places. But here, in this small corner of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, on 3 acres that everyone said was worthless and 400 acres that everyone else wanted to destroy, the old-growth forest still stands, protected by a widow's determination and a dead man's love. This is how secrets keep faith. This is how love persists beyond death. This is how stewardship works, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet accumulation of small acts of care, in the patient waiting for someone to be ready to understand, in the absolute certainty that when the moment comes, The one person who needs to find the truth will find it, because that was the plan all along. Dottie Macalister, at 72, had thought her story was over. She had thought her role was to be the widow, to settle into grief, to watch the world continue without her husband. But the wooden bookmark and the hollowed oak and the documents hidden in marine epoxy said something else entirely. The story was not over. It was just reaching its beginning, and she had been chosen by a man who loved her more than he could say, to be the guardian of something worth protecting. The months after the injunction was lifted and the forest was secured were strange and disorienting in their own way. Dottie had spent so much energy in the immediate aftermath of Gordon's death, managing logistics and attending to the practical details of loss, that she hadn't stopped to think about what came next. The grief didn't disappear. When the court papers were filed, it transformed, became something different, something that lived alongside a growing sense of purpose. She would wake in the morning and think about Gordon, but not just in the way she had before. Now she thought about his foresight, his planning, his absolute confidence that she would find what he had left for her and do exactly what needed to be done with it. The timber rights attorney she had hired remained on retainer, helping her navigate the complex legal landscape of conservation easements and sustainable harvest agreements. The law in Michigan was relatively clear about what could and could not be done, but the details required understanding, and Dottie was determined to understand them. She spent hours in the library in Marquette, researching forestry policy, reading about different conservation models, learning about the economics of sustainable timber management. It was not unlike her work as a school librarian. It was the work of learning something new, of finding the information you needed, of understanding before you acted. One afternoon, while she was sitting at a library table with a stack of books about Michigan's forestry history, a young woman sat down across from her. Her name was Sarah, and she was a graduate student at Michigan Tech, studying sustainable forest management. She had read about the conservation easement that had just been filed. The story had made local news, even if the details had been somewhat sensationalized, and she recognized Dottie from the photos that had been published. Sarah introduced herself, and she asked if Dottie would be willing to talk about what had happened. What started as a single conversation turned into several conversations, and those conversations turned into something that Dottie hadn't expected, a collaboration. Sarah helped Dottie understand the technical aspects of the sustainable harvest plan that Gordon had designed. Together, they reviewed his notes, his calculations, his philosophy of forestry, and they realized that Gordon had been thinking in sophisticated, scientifically sound ways about forest management decades before sustainability became fashionable. Sarah introduced Dottie to other people: foresters, conservation advocates, educators who worked with high school students interested in environmental science. Through these connections, the idea of the Sawmill as an educational site began to take shape. It wasn't something that Dottie had originally intended, but as she talked to more people and understood more clearly what Gordon's life work had been about, she realized that the best way to honor his legacy was not just to protect the forest, but to teach people why protection mattered. The restoration of the sawmill took longer than Dottie had expected. The building had been deteriorating for decades, and there was more structural work needed than anyone initially realized. But slowly, carefully, piece by piece, the great timber frame structure was brought back to something like its original condition. The corrugated metal roof was replaced with historically accurate materials. The log carriage was cleaned and restored, its oak beam carefully treated and sealed. The scattered debris was cleared. The ferns were allowed to continue growing, but were curated rather than eliminated. The sense of peaceful abandonment was maintained, while the building itself became functional again. On the day that the first group of high school students came to the sawmill, Dottie stood in the restored structure and felt something shift in her understanding of what this place meant. The students walked slowly around the building, touching the oak carriage beam with curious fingers, asking questions about how the sawmill had worked, when it had operated, why it had been abandoned. Dottie told them about timber harvesting practices, about the difference between sustainable forestry and clear cutting, about the philosophy of leaving the forest healthier than you found it. One student asked her why she cared so much about trees. It was such a simple question that it seemed to contain a whole world of incomprehension. How could she explain what it meant to be married to someone who cared about trees the way most people care about their children? How could she explain the particular love story of a man and the forest he had devoted his life to protecting? How could she explain that love, expressed in the form of documents hidden in marine epoxy and carved wooden bookmarks, had become the driving force of her own life now? She tried. She told the students about Gordon, about how he had walked these forests, about how he had kept careful records of which trees were which age, about how he had understood that a forest was not just a resource to be exploited, but an ecosystem that deserved respect and careful stewardship. She told them that the reason she cared about trees was because someone she loved had cared about them, and in honoring his caring, she had come to understand that it mattered. The students listened, and Dottie could see some of them beginning to understand something about the world that they hadn't understood before. She picked up the brown leather suitcase, its brass clasps worn shiny from use, and she carried it back into the restored sawmill, where photographs on the walls now showed the forest through the seasons, where students came to learn about the philosophy of sustainable harvest, where Gordon's life work lived on in the minds of young people who had never met him but who understood, through Dottie's patient teaching, why it mattered. The suitcase had become something of a symbol for the students. Dottie would bring it with her sometimes when she came to the sawmill, and she would show them photographs inside, documents, the wooden bookmark that Gordon had carved. The log carriage still stands in the center of the sawmill, no longer operational, but no longer rusting either. The wood has been carefully restored. The great oak beam where Gordon had hidden his message gleams with fresh finish, the careful craftsmanship of the restoration work visible to anyone who looked closely. Children run their hands along it when they visit, and Dottie tells them the story. Not the whole story, just enough to help them understand that ordinary places can hold extraordinary secrets, that people who seem quiet and unimportant might be doing the most important work of all, that love sometimes speaks in ways that can only be understood long after the person who loved has gone. She tells them that the man who built this carriage 100 years ago, who maintained it, who finally hid his greatest gift inside it, wasn't famous. He was not rich. He was not the kind of person who made headlines or won awards. But he changed the world in this small way, in this one forest, by caring enough to do something difficult and secretive and hopeful. As word of the educational program spread, Dottie received requests from schools, from universities, from forestry departments and conservation organizations, all wanting to bring students to learn about sustainable harvesting and forest management. She worked with the Land Trust to develop curricula, to create a model that other communities might replicate in their own forests. The sawmill, which had been a forgotten relic of a dying industry, became a beacon for a new way of thinking about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. The money that might have come from selling the timber rights to the highest bidder never materialized in Dottie's bank account, and she came to understand that she didn't need it to. The income from carefully, sustainably managed timber sales was modest but sufficient. She could live her life, maintain the forest, continue the educational work, all without the kind of wealth that might have come from selling everything to a development company or a clear-cutting operation. More importantly, she could look herself in the mirror each morning and know that she was doing exactly what Gordon had asked her to do. She was a steward. She was protecting something that had taken centuries to grow. She was leaving the forest healthier than she had found it. Russ eventually went away, though not without one final bitter attempt to challenge the timber rights in court. The legal challenge failed, just as his lawyer had warned him it would. The documents were airtight. Gordon had separated the timber rights from the land 40 years earlier, long before there was any dispute, so there was no way to argue that he had done it in bad faith or to circumvent the inheritance. The filing was legal and valid and unchangeable. Russ disappeared after that, and Dottie heard through distant relatives that he had eventually sold the land to another company and moved to Arizona. Wayne maintained a careful distance, never contacting Dottie, never returning to the area. This is the truth that Gordon carved into the wooden bookmark and hid in his library books and sealed with marine epoxy in the oak carriage beam. Dottie was never powerless. She was never small. She was never meant to be dismissed or belittled or given only the scraps of the world. She was chosen, before he died, to be the keeper of something precious. And when she found what he had left for her, she did exactly what he knew she would do. She protected it. She honored it. She made it matter. In doing so, she proved something that needed to be proven, that a woman in her 70s, a librarian, a widow, a person that the world had told to get out of the way and stop bothering people, such a woman could change everything. Not through violence or manipulation or deception, but through the simple act of caring about something enough to learn about it, to fight for it, to devote the remaining years of her life to its protection. And in doing so, she found a way to live the rest of her life, with purpose, with meaning, with the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you are part of something larger than yourself. Something that will outlast you. Something that matters. She became, in the end, the person her husband always knew she was, a woman of quiet strength, a protector of beauty, a keeper of truth, a steward of the earth. She became exactly what he imagined when he carved that bookmark and hid those documents and waited, with the patience of a dying man, for her to be ready to understand. The remarkable thing was not that Gordon had done this, for he was a man of remarkable foresight and remarkable faith in his wife. The remarkable thing was that Dottie, who had been given every reason to despair, who had been treated as if she were invisible and powerless and unworthy of respect, had found within herself the strength to do what needed to be done. Years later, after Dottie had been running the educational program at the Sawmill for a long time, a former student came back to visit. His name was Jacob, and he had been in one of the first groups to come through the Sawmill program. He had gone on to study forestry in college, to work for the U.S. Forest Service, to dedicate his career to the kind of sustainable management that Gordon had pioneered. Jacob brought his own daughter to the sawmill, and he showed her the log carriage, and he told her the story of how his high school teacher had shown him a different way to think about forests, about how people could use natural resources without destroying the things that made those resources valuable in the first place. That was the moment when Dottie understood the full scope of what Gordon had given to her. It wasn't just a forest. It wasn't just timber rights worth millions of dollars. It was the ability to change the trajectory of other people's lives, to influence the way they thought about the world, to inspire them toward a better way of being. It was the power to create meaning in her own life by dedicating herself to something that mattered. Gordon had given her the tools to do this, the documents, the forest, the educational opportunity, the knowledge that she was trusted to do the right thing. But she was the one who had wielded those tools. She was the one who had chosen to use them in service of something larger than herself. She was the one who had decided that her remaining years would be spent in the service of the forest that her husband had loved. The wooden bookmark still sits on Dottie's windowsill next to a jar of pine needles and a photograph of Gordon standing in front of the sawmill with his hand on the great oak carriage, smiling at the camera in the particular quiet way that he had of smiling. Sometimes, Dottie picks up the bookmark and reads the words on the back. "The carriage holds the truth, Dot. Where the oak meets the iron, pry where the knot is." And she remembers not just the moment when she found the documents, but all the moments that came after. The moment she decided to restore the sawmill, the moment she met Sarah, the moment the first student asked why she cared about trees, the moment Jacob came back with his own daughter, each one a thread in a tapestry that Gordon had begun weaving long before his death. These days, Dottie walks through the forest in the early mornings, when the mist is still rising from the forest floor and the light is just beginning to filter through the canopy of old-growth pines. The cathedral silence of the ancient forest surrounds her. The paper birch glows white. The jack pine stands tall and patient. The tamarack grows along the edges of the boggy places, and the sound of woodpeckers echoing through the trees reminds her that the forest is alive, that it is growing, that it is being stewarded carefully, that it will outlast her just as she is outlasting Gordon. And sometimes, in that profound quiet, Dottie swears she can hear footsteps just ahead of hers on the trail, steady and purposeful, moving deeper into the forest. She smiles and keeps walking because she knows who it is, and she knows where they are going. They are going to the place where the trees are oldest, where the ecosystem is most intact, where the work of stewardship is most clearly visible. They are going to the heart of the forest that they both loved. Gordon's forest is safe now. It will be safe for another generation, and another after that, because a man loved it enough to make careful, secret plans, and because a woman loved him enough to find those plans and honor them. The timber industry moved on. Clear-cut operations stripped other forests. Profit margins were realized in other places. Russ and Wayne are living their lives somewhere else, probably still unaware of the full scope of what Gordon had done, still not understanding that the quiet man they had dismissed as irrelevant had outmaneuvered them through nothing but love and foresight and faith in his wife. But here, in this small corner of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, on 3 acres that everyone said was worthless and 400 acres that everyone else wanted to destroy, the old-growth forest still stands, protected by a widow's determination and a dead man's love. This is how secrets keep faith. This is how love persists beyond death. This is how stewardship works, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet accumulation of small acts of care. in the patient waiting for someone to be ready to understand, in the absolute certainty that when the moment comes, the one person who needs to find the truth will find it, because that was the plan all along. My heart overflows with gratitude that you stayed with Dottie through every single moment of her extraordinary journey, from devastating humiliation to unexpected triumph, from a rusted sawmill that everyone laughed at to a forest worth millions that only she could protect, from painful erasure to powerful stewardship. If her story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been profoundly underestimated because of your age, if you've been discarded by the very people who should have valued you most, if you've discovered that what looked like a devastating ending was actually the beginning of something more beautiful than you'd ever imagined, leave just one word in the comments describing the exact moment when you realized you were so much stronger than anyone ever thought you could be. Because Dottie's story proves something powerful and true. That loyalty and genuine love create legacies that greed can never touch, no matter how hard it tries. That sometimes the cruelest wills contain the greatest gifts. That justice may move slowly, but it never, ever gets the address wrong. That you are never too old to become the guardian of something sacred. Share this story with someone who desperately needs to remember that their worth isn't defined by who discarded them, but by who loved them enough to protect them, even from beyond the grave. Because together, we prove that the last chapter is never the end. It's where the real story begins. Welcome to the last chapter.